Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my work. So, today I'm gonna talk with you about the politics of protective social policies for non-standard workers. And I took a particular case of these policies, which are the social policy for the self-employed, not for temporary employees or for part-time employees, but for the self-employed. Let me explain you why. So, first of all, in an era, as you know, characterized by increasing welfare retrenchment pressures, increasing dualization of the labor market, it is actually quite puzzling that in several European countries, we see that non-standard workers, so part-time employees, temporary employees, and the self-employed, have actually their social protection improved by several reforms. And I choose among all the protective social policy, those for the self-employed. Why? Because I consider it as a, maybe not a hard case, but let's say a hard test for testing a political theory explaining their adoption. Why? It is a hard case. Basically, contrary to part-time employees, for example, and a bit less for temporary employees, but still, they are numerically marginal. Usually, they represent, in the 18 countries of my panel, between 5% of the labor force, and the most extreme case in Southern European countries, around 20% of the labor force. The thing is, they are not only numerically marginal, which would explain why there would not be actually quite a high demand for their social protection, but also they are very heterogeneous, contrary to part-time employees and temporary employees. In the same employment status, there are actually some regulated professions, architects, lawyers, for example. You have genuine entrepreneurs, you have shopkeepers, artisans, and also what now we actually observe, freelancers, platform workers, or more precarious forms, and much less regulated form of work. So they are small, their interest is actually very heterogeneous, and they are not very well organized collectively. First, the self-employed association are actually associations that were here for maybe in some countries more than a century. So they are actually not very sensitive to what we call new self-employed demands, which are social protection demands. Usually these associations, they prefer to decrease at the maximum the social contribution for the self-employed, and so to minimize the social protection for the self-employed in order to let the self-employed, so for example, shopkeepers or architects, to, how can I say, manage better their commercial risk. And last point, they are, and this is a very important point for my presentation, they are very actually difficult to represent for unions. In some countries, union membership is actually forbidden for the self-employed. In others they are, but already union has some difficulties to represent outsiders in general, so outsiders that are that actually heterogeneous in terms of interest, and that's more, it's actually, they don't have many incentives to represent them. So, based on all actually this observation, we could expect that there won't be welfare reforms and particularly generous protective social policies that would be implemented for the self-employed, which is not the case. So I compiled actually all the reforms since 2000 that have been implemented in 18 Western European countries. I will not enter too much into the details of coding, of my coding, but more details are available in my paper. But the thing that is actually important here to understand is that you have 4 categories of reform. First, you have the reform here that specifically targets a subgroup of the self-employed. Usually, it's either platform workers or what I call genuine self-employed, entrepreneurs, shopkeepers, regulated professions. And then you have here welfare reforms that target all the self-employed. And I differentiate two types of reform. The first one here are reforms opening the eligibility of several social schemes that are done initially for employees to the self-employed. Then here you have actually more encompassing reforms. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to tell you. So here you open the eligibility of social scheme to several types of self-employed, or maybe to all self-employed in most cases, but the self-employed stay self-employed. They are not actually reclassified as employees or don't benefit from any labor law regulation. Why? You have actually another type of reforms here in which several labor law rights are actually extended to either many categories of self-employed or all the self-employed. So I tried to make sense of these cross-national variations. And for that, I look at what I call the usual suspects in the literature of the politics of protective social policies, for the politics of protective social policies for non-standard workers, and they don't actually really fit. First, there are some structural accounts, which would mean basically that where the self-employed increased substantially in the last 20 years, it would be here that demand would be actually quite high for welfare reform for the self-employed, and so that we would see in these countries more than in others reforms that would be adopted, which is not actually the case. Then you have the most important one in the literature, the welfare regimes, actually accounts. The problem with that, if you look at our categorization, is that it works only for what we call liberal welfare regimes. Basically here, the UK and Ireland, they adopted some changes in the social protection for all the self-employed. But then if you look at other categories, so for example, let's say the Nordic social democratic welfare states, you have Sweden and Denmark that didn't implement substantial changes. Why? Finland did, and which is one of my case studies. I will come back on this particular case later. Then, if you look at more conservative welfare states, you have very similar welfare states that have diverging outcomes. For example, here in Austria, there were welfare reforms that were adopted, not in Germany. In France, not at all. Why? In Italy, yes. And you can continue like this with actually several conservative welfare states. So this is quite puzzling. Then you could have collective representation accounts. They might be than before, basically where the self-employed, the new self-employed, let's say freelancers, those that actually want to increase social protection, would be very well collectively organized through specific associations for them. You would normally predict that welfare reform would be adopted in those countries, which is not the case. Same with the social protection baseline account. So here you can see, I basically compiled what was the social protection of the self-employed in 2000. Here again, we don't see actually quite a strong correlation. Business accounts, business cycle accounts. So here the literature will predict, yes, when we are actually in times of economic expansion, there is a fiscal space to adopt, let's say, generous social protection. While in times of recession, it would not be the case, and so it would be less likely that such reform would be adopted. Which again, here I cannot show you, I have a table with the dates of all the reforms, and many of these reforms were adopted during the Great Recession. Then we have partisan accounts, which is probably the most important one in the literature. What are the predictions here? Basically, first you have, Spink-Andersen and Corpy that would predict that center-left parties, the classic power resources theory, that basically where center-left party rule the country, rule the government, then it is likely that they would adopt generous social policy. Here again, I did some tests. This is not the case. And then David Reda actually came into this debate with his seminal work and said, wait, it depends. it depends. Maybe they do this for insiders, but not for outsiders, or only when they can for outsiders, but that's not their priorities. Here again, I tested this hypothesis, and it didn't explain new left parties, green parties. They actually don't adopt more protective social policy than, for example, conservative and liberal parties. Then, and this is the last one, if I will remember, the union strength accounts. So basically, where unions, because they are defenders of insiders, this is actually the assumption from David Reda's work, where unions were strong. So basically, we should not see adoption of such reforms, which again is not the case. And finally, we have institutional accounts, which are the political institutions, basically in proportional representation systems. You're supposed to have, let's say, small parties, such as New Left, that are more often in power, and so that will adopt more actively reforms for outsiders, while more majoritarian parties, this will not be the case. UK, in this case, is a very good example where such reforms were adopted, but still were in a majoritarian party, in a majoritarian representation system. I will come back on this explanation by testing them in my 2 case studies in a few minutes. So the thing is, after this review that is quite tiring, but the main point here is that most of this explanation, they rely on one work, which is the seminal work of David Reda, which is foundational in the literature on the politics of welfare reforms today. Basically, it assumes that insiders and outsiders diverge in terms of welfare interests. Insiders, they're actually quite scared in terms of retrenchment of the welfare state, that they will lose their access to some social benefits if the government adopts encompassing eligibility schemes. So they may consent even to the liberalization of those schemes. What I think, and I'm not the only one, because there is also a more recent line of research that show that, is that there could be not only a divergence, but a convergence of welfare interest here. I would like to thank Johan. Is your I develop and extend actually ID here? Thank you. So it's not that I go against David Reda's assumption. As I said, David Reda's assumption of welfare interest divergence is conditional. It depends on the institutional settings of the country. So the first, and actually I forgot also to put one paper of Timo, I don't know if he's online here. The first actually scholars that studied this hypothesis for part-time employees and temporary employees found that sometimes in some specific institutional settings, insiders, they can fear that with the growth of the margin of the labor market, they will actually compete with those outsiders. And so employers, they could be encouraged to substitute stable form of jobs, of employment, by more temporary, part-time, precarious, or more work arrangements in which actually social contribution that they would pay would be lower. So in a cost equalization logic, they would actually support the improved social protection of outsiders, specifically here in our case of the self-employed, because it would increase the social contribution paid by employers for uniting the self-employed. And then you have the similar work of Pallier and Thielen that show that also insiders and outsiders can have actually convergent welfare interests, while sometimes insiders would like to would support to how can I say, to open the eligibility of social scheme to outsiders, and especially to part-time and temporary employees, because otherwise their hard-won social entitlements that actually they conquered for decades and even centuries of struggles would actually won't be financially sustainable, because some of these workers, the outsiders, the non-standard workers would pay less social contribution, and so it will actually jeopardize the finances of the social security scheme. So, to build my theory of the politics of welfare reform for the self-employed, I would actually rely on this literature and I would extend it. Here is my theory. And so you will see that my theory is quite embedded with my methodology. Why? I use a process tracing approach, which means that basically I need to theorize each step of the process of adoption of welfare reforms. So this is what I'm going to do here. So I do not reject insider-outsider divergence, I develop and extend it. The first step I hypothesize is demand activation. So you have the new self-employed, there are numbers that are increasing in an economy. And they increase particularly in the same occupation as those out of insiders, which is the case in the country of my panel. So here it's an average, it's a country average data for all the country of my panel. So basically the main information here is that here you have the percentage of, so the share of each of this occupation in the total of solo self-employment for this country. And what you can observe, there are three categories of solo self-employed, of where solo self-employment is increasing. First, you have professionals, so high-skilled workers here that could be actually assumed to be insiders. Second, you have service and sales workers, which are here up compared to here. And the last one, in a lesser extent, are the crafts and trade workers. So basically, especially for the trade workers and for the professionals, these are occupations in which you could find actually many insiders. So they could actually feel threatened by the increase of new self-employment that could actually compete with them. And so it's possible that first, these new self-employed, these freelancers, they're increasing in numbers, they feel more and more that actually they lack unemployment benefits, proper access to health insurance, pensions, etc. And they could collectively organize in association, which is what we see in several countries. I'm going to introduce it to you now. However, I hypothesize that this is not enough. It's not enough because they're actually small in number. They are marginal in the labor market. They don't have the structural power resources and often not the institutional power resources for the association that are actually quite recent to fight for their rights. And here comes an interactive, my interactive model. So I suppose that to see welfare reforms adopted for the self-employed, you need first to have demand from the self-employed for that. And second, also the consent of insiders that would form a coalition with these new self-employed. And I'm going to introduce you now in what condition. I assume that it is when insiders feel vulnerable, which is when their employment protection is either low or eroding. So where the employment protection legislation of permanent and stable workers, of insiders, are actually eroding in the last years due to reforms of the government. So it is easier for employers to actually dismiss them. Then I assume that they can feel threatened by the increase of new self-employment in their occupation. Why? In other institutional settings, it will not be the case, where they're actually quite well protected and their employment protection has been quite stable in the last years. Then even if new self-employment actually increase, they will not support it. They will not support the welfare reforms to regulate solo self-employment because they're quite well protected. Their job is quite well protected. So I assume basically that in the situation, this one where, the first one where they are not protected, where they are threatened, then their unions reframes first new self-employment in terms of social dumping, in terms of substitution threats. While in other countries where they are protected, such reframing do not occur. And then, in the institutional setting where the employment protection actually eroded recently or is quite low, and so insiders are feeling actually threatened by substitution threats, then they will form coalition with new self-employed association, which will not, of course, occur where actually they are not vulnerable, their constituents are not vulnerable. And finally, last step, when new self-employment has been framed in terms not of a margin in the labor market that no one cares because it's actually quite small, but in terms of a danger for your working condition as insiders, in terms of social dumping, substitution, etc., then this reframing and this coalition that is formed on this basis decrease the political cost of inclusion for the government. While in other countries where new self-employment is not actually framed as a danger for insiders, and there is no insider unions that brokered coalitions with the new self-employed, then the cost of inaction for the government is quite low, and so either they do not reform or they adopt blame-avoiding minimal reform. So this is my theory. To test this theory, I selected 4 cases. So today, because I don't have more time, I don't have a lot of time, so I will focus only on the comparisons between 2 similar economies, which are France and Italy. They are similar on all actually the explanation that I mentioned earlier. First, in terms of welfare regime, both of them are Bismarckian welfare states. In terms of union power, actually their unions have quite a strong institutional veto power, but a low structural veto power. They have actually in both countries self-employed organization, even though they're quite fragmented. Their political institutions, France is majoritarian, Italy before 2017, it was quite mixed, a bit more proportional. And then from 2017, it became a majoritarian representation system. Partisan variation. So in France, we had François Hollande, Nicolas Sarkozy, Jacques Chirac, and Emmanuel Macron government, center-right, center-left. And in Italy, which is good for us as political scientists, we had quite a diversity of government, from technocratic government to far-right government, center-left, center-right. Oh, yes. And then, yes, same in terms of economic cycles, they both actually endure the Great Recession and also the recovery periods. And basically, the social protection of self-employed in 2000 were similar in these 2 countries, which means basically nothing, almost, except health insurance that is universal and pensions, just the first pillar of the pension system. So, what happened in these 2 countries? First, in Italy, we are here at the beginning, in the early 2000s. And in Italy, demand for the social protection of the new self-employed from self-employed association were activated. Basically, the Treux and the Biaggi reforms in the late 90s and early 20s flexibilized solo self-employment. It increased their numbers, and then from 2004, we can actually see the self-employed collectively organized in 2 associations. First in ACTA for the high-skilled solo self-employed, and then more, let's say, precarious form of solo self-employment, and not only just all precarious workers organized in what we call the San Precario movements. However, even 10 years later, no policy actually were implemented. Then something else happened. Great Recession. It was actually felt quite strong in Italy, and especially for insiders. So the employment protection of insiders were quite well attacked. I'll not enter too much into the details, but from 2010, basically it was easier for employers to dismiss, insiders to reduce insiders' employment protection and to dismiss these insiders. Then successive reform with a technocratic government and then with Matteo Renzi continued in that direction. And what we can see is actually, as I theorize, then from 2012, the main three unions changed actually their position regarding solo self-employment. Here, at that moment, it was either something that solo self-employment that they encourage at that moment. CISL and UIL actually encourage the reform that flexibilized solo self-employment, while the main union in Italy, CGIL, basically just wanted to contain their numbers, but never actually mentioned any kind of improvement of social protection for these workers. While from 2012, they jointly called, in a public call, to equalize employer and freelancer cost differences. And they actually quite strongly, this is what I'm going to show now, brokered a coalition. So they created some organization that were actually gathering union members and new self-employed, where they could talk and how can I say, do some activism for the welfare reform for the new self-employed. CGIL, which is the main union, actually collected 1 million petition signatures for the workers' rights. There were actually several instances of such coalition, and you can see that very strong changes occurred in Italy during the Great Recession. First, the technocratic government of Mario Monti adopted both labor law extension measures and opened also the eligibility of several social schemes to several categories of the self-employed that are called parasubordinati, COCOPRO and COCOPRO. Then Renzi and Gentiloni, so center-left government, did actually the same. And here again, I will not enter into the details for the sake of time, but the most important point is even the far right, actually, Giorgia Meloni, adopted a kind of, it would not be called a minimum wage, but let's say a minimum level of remuneration for all the self-employed in the country, same to equalize actually labor costs between the self-employed and the non-self-employed wage-dependent workers. In France, such process did not occur. Why? Actually, also in France, Nicolas Sarkozy flexibilized quite extensively, the self-employment status, and we have almost 3 million actually self-employed over a population of almost 30 millions of workers in France, so almost 10%. The self-employed are organized very well in France. They have a very strong association, and this association has institutional access to the decision-making process in the social security related policy and institutions. But unions, and this didn't change even today, they didn't back their demands for increased social protection. Why? In France, as you may know, employment protection is quite high and stable, not for outsiders, but for insiders. Actually, reform that even strengthened their employment protection from the 2000 to 2010. And then François Hollande and Emmanuel Macron touched a little bit the employment protection, so reduced actually the unfair dismissal damages, but to be sure that they will not discontent them, also increase the statutory severance for insiders. So EPL stayed quite strong, and union didn't reframe self-employment as they did in Italy during the Great Recession. They kept saying that actually freelancers are outside their domain. Yes, I will be fast here. And basically, what they did, they framed actually the opening of social scheme of the self-employed, the opening, of social scheme to the self-employed as a risk for the finances of these social schemes. And here, no coalition occurred, while there were actually several windows of opportunities. Several times, actually, politicians, especially Emmanuel Macron, proposed to reform actually the welfare state for the self-employed. Here again, not entering into the details, but they didn't back this reform. They only say as a blame-avoiding strategy, let's give rights to platform workers, which are the most, let's say, salient, precarious self-employed, but quite minimal in numbers. And yeah, so there were only blame-avoiding reforms that were adopted. So I will conclude here. So the limitation of my work here, I studied the politics of welfare reform for non-standard workers, but I took, of course, only a specific subgroup of them, the self-employed. I also think that there is potential equifinality because my theory explains 16 out of the 18 countries of my panel. And of course, in my case selection, I also study Finland and Sweden, so my findings are only limited to coordinating market economies. I believe that I contribute a bit to 3 literatures. Here first, I move welfare politics for the self-employed beyond only just discussion on platform work. Second, attack quite a foundation in the politics of the welfare state by conditionalizing David Reda's work. And finally, I show that in some institutional settings, dualization can generate not only defensive welfare exclusion, but also defensive welfare inclusion. Thank you. Thank you.